Okay, folks, we're live.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Murphy. I'm the MC for tonight's Sydney Politics in the Pub. So welcome to all of our online audience, and I'm very much apologetic for the delay, and I hope you've been able to be patient and hang in for this connection. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. And I acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people online tonight. Because of the pandemic situation, this session has to be online, even though the Hotel Harry is now open. So thank you for joining. If you want to put a question or a comment in the Q&A part of the program, you will need to use the chat facility in YouTube, which you can find by clicking on the promo slide for tonight's event at politicsinthepub.org.au. So the topic tonight is Methane Moment, Australia's COP26 betrayal of people and planet. Right now, media attention is off the threat of global warming, but you can tell by the Labor victory in the Bega by-election last Saturday that global warming remains a hot issue with voters and is going to be a major issue in the coming federal election. You may remember some of the dynamics at Glasgow last December, but our two speakers tonight will really give a vivid account of the disappointment and how the Morrison government contributed to that. So the speakers tonight are Bronwyn Adcock and Stuart Rees. Bronwyn Adcock is an award-winning Australian journalist and writer with 25 years experience. She's worked as a radio current affairs reporter and radio documentary maker for the ABC, as a video journalist for the international affairs program Dateline on SBS Television Australia, and as a freelance writer for the Griffith Review, the Saturday paper and the Monthly. In September last year, her first book, Carowind, was released by Black Ink. It's a moving insider's account of surviving one of Australia's worst bushfires and how we live with fire in a climate change world. In Carowind, Bronwyn tells her story and those of many others, what they saw, thought and felt as they battled a blaze never seen before intensity. Our second speaker is Stuart Rees, Emeritus Professor at the University of Sydney, a founder of the Sydney Peace Foundation and a human rights activist in several countries, particularly dealing with Palestine. He's taught at major universities in the US and UK and was Professor of Social Work at the University of Sydney. He's the author of books on social justice, on evaluations of economic policies, on healthcare, on empowerment in social policy and social welfare, and on links between the arts, poetry, music, personal biography, and courage in public life. His most recent book is Cruelty or Humanity: Challenges, Opportunities, Responsibilities. So Stuart and Bronwyn will each speak for up to 20 minutes, and then we will move to the question and answer session through to our 7:15 finish time. So please welcome Stuart Rees to the microphone. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Peter. And look, I'm going to cut short because what I am going to say, because we've started over 15 minutes late. I'm particularly concerned to hear Bronwyn sifting her account in that very engaging book. The Australia's COP26 betrayal. COP26 refers to a conference of the parties. In other words, it's been those conferences about the threats of climate change have been going on for decades, and this was the 26th one. The UK was the president, hence it being held in Glasgow. The methane moment refers to the betrayal by Scott Morrison on behalf of the Australian people. The President of the United States, the European Union, and up to 100 other countries had demanded a cut in the emission of methane gases of at least 30% as a sort of optimistic prelude to the Glasgow conference. Those gases coming from cattle, from deposits in landfill, from oil and gas developments. Australia refused point blank to go along with that cut, hence the reference to methane moment. And Morrison instead identified himself with other countries which don't respect the threats of global warming, in particular Russia, India, and China. And to give you some idea of the absurdity of the behaviour of the government, in defence of the betrayal of Scott Morrison, Barnaby Joyce said the only way to deal with cutting methane was for somebody to take a rifle and to shoot all the cattle that existed in Australia. Now, before Morrison got on the plane to go to Glasgow, he basically packed a suitcase full of selfishness. And I want to use that concept, selfishness, to surround or to convey the essence of Australia's attitude to the threats of climate change. And the selfishness is not only is visible in all sorts of policies. Even the concern to encourage every Australian to have at least a third jab against the threats of COVID came at a time when about 1% of the people of the continent of Africa had only had at the most one jab, if they'd had that at all. You can see the selfishness in the cruel and what I would now call evil behaviour towards asylum seekers and refugees. You can see the selfishness in the alliance which the government makes with the fossil fuel industry. And it's no accident that the Australian pavilion in Glasgow was sponsored by the oil and gas giant Santos. And that comes at a time when as Morrison landed in Glasgow, the Australia Institute back here announced that we had 71 coal mines in operation, some of them relatively new developments, and plans for about 40 new oil and gas projects. So the Australian indifference to climate change was almost writ large for all to see. The other selfishness comes in this consummate deceit called technology, not taxes. When most of the world's research stations, in particular at Stanford University, would tell you that the technology to contain the consequences of carbon dioxide into the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere doesn't exist, or what does exist is ineffective. And there is such a negative connotation of the word taxes in this country that we're not allowed to consider what the enormous benefits of that of such taxation of taxes are in public services, in investment in public institutions. And that's really what, and one of those public institutions is called ARENA, the Australian Research Energy Association, which is a fund developed, I think, by Turnbull to foster the development of alternative energy, renewable energy. Yet the evidence is, not just the evidence, that Taylor and Angus Taylor, the minister, and Scott Morrison have been using money from ARENA to foster oil and gas projects. So that the deceit goes along with the selfishness. There's this sort of almost explicit alliance with the fossil fuel industry, as though the government's re-election depends on the collusion with every voter and every power broker in coal constituencies. I want to move towards two particular legal decisions or that were apparent almost immediately after Scott Morrison's betrayal in Glasgow. The first is an action in the federal court taken by 8 teenagers, supervised by a nun, arguing that climate action was a crime against future generations. That they were particularly arguing against the extension of a coal mine in Gunnedah. And if you remember, Justice Mordecai Blomberg in the federal court ruled on behalf of the teenagers and said that climate change was would exert constant perpetual damage to future generations. and amounted to a crime. In response to that decision, the coal company, Whitehaven Coal, which owned the Gunnedah mine, protested the judgment of the court being in favor of the teenagers. And it went to the stock exchange almost immediately. And this is the sort of deceit that we are expected to ignore, to say that it only mined clean coal, and the burning of clean coal was somehow a means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's slavery is freedom. It's a kind of another Orwellian statement. So, how do we respond to this deceit? How do we respond to this selfishness? I'm a great believer in the notion that, particularly for the immediate future, in a way, the characteristics of the people depicted in Bronwyn's books fulfill this. I'm a great believer in the notion that policy has to be about the dominance of altruism over egoism, the dominance of altruism over selfishness. In other words, a commitment to a collective well-being. It's what indigenous peoples around the world called the gift relationship, the effort made on behalf of others, even if you don't know them well, without expectation of reward. And I might make, just to sum it up, because I want to move with a sense of urgency to hear what Bronwyn's going to say, especially after having had to wait for 20 minutes to get the Zoom paraphernalia underway. I mean, clearly, what we're talking about is the need for a shift in economics, a shift in the way we measure well-being, a shift in the way we measure happiness or progress. It's in Kate Raworth's book. She's talking about, which is called donor economics. She talks about everybody needing and searching for a safe place within planetary boundaries. And that concept, I think we're going to hear about a safe place and how do you conjure safe places faced with catastrophe in a minute. And the last point I'd make concerns the utter seriousness of the climate change issues. And I sense that it will become, I do hope it will be a major issue in the coming federal election. The advisors to the Court of Human Rights just conceptualize the notion of ecocide, which is willful and permanent damage to the environment, which they are trying to propose is a crime against humanity. So that's where I'll finish. The essence of the argument about ecocide is that the neoliberal belief that we have to have growth at all costs is an expression of violence, a guarantee of future destruction, a guarantee of the destruction of animal habitats for sure, and in the words of that particular court judgment, a crime against humanity. And I think I've been sufficiently pessimistic to hand over to Bronwyn in the hope of hearing some optimism.
Thanks, Stuart. No, I'm pretty pessimistic too, to be honest. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, I just dropped out there. Look, just before I kind of go to what I wanted to talk about, I just want to touch on what you said, Stuart, about altruism. And I think you're right. Having lived in a heavily bushfire impacted community for 2 months, what was absolutely outstanding amidst the absolute horror and disruption of it all was incredible altruism. I mean, without sounding too cliched, the community really did pull together. People really did look out for each other. And the thing is that with a fire like the scale of the fires we had down the eastern seaboard that summer, everyone was in some kind of terrible boat. So there was no one in our area on the south coast, there was no one getting off lightly, but still people were helping others. So, numerous stories of people who just saw their own house burnt down and go, right, my house is gone, I'll go and pick up a hose and try and save someone else's house. People who gave up work for months on end to volunteer at the food distribution places, you know, people in towns who weren't directly being hit by fire, who took in billets, like informal billet systems, people who were stranded. So, incredible altruism, and I think incredible strength in community effort as well. You know, and the other thing that was said in the introduction about, you know, the recent by-election in Bega, I mean, that's also true. Look, it has been 2 years since the fires, but for people living in bushfire-affected communities, it's still a very, very raw issue. You know, there's still a huge amount of work to be done. People are still very traumatised. People are still very economically disadvantaged by what happened. So the idea that we have kind of somehow moved on is ridiculous. It's really, really close. But look, I'll kind of tell briefly my story about how I came to write this book. So in kind of, you know, about September, October, I think 2019, so the bushfire, you know, it's funny, we talk about the fires of 2019, 2020 as Black Summer. It's actually a bit of a misnomer because it actually started in September. It started well before summer. So I was really interested. So pretty much by September, by the end of October, so way before summer, the fire season in the North Coast was already completely off the scale that anyone had ever seen before. So fire scientists, even the, you know, New South Wales RFS Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons was saying this is completely off the scale. So it was big. There was fires up the North Coast. They couldn't be put out. Whole towns were getting fire blasted through them. So I was really interested in this because I was reading some really interesting work, you know, particularly a fire scientist from Tasmania, a guy called Professor David Bowman, who was just saying this fire season is going to be, you know, one for the history books. Like effectively what is happening now is unprecedented. So I pitched a story to the monthly magazine and I wanted to write about the fires. And the particular thing that I was really interested in writing about was kind of had this idea of it'd be really good to get a portrait of what it's like to live inside a climate change world, you know, from a very human on the ground perspective. Like what does it feel like? What does it smell like? What happens in that world, in your community? So I was very focused on the North Coast and the North Coast fires. And I was talking to people on the North Coast. I was emailing people saying, can we talk? And then one day in late November, about kind of 30 kilometres southwest of where I live on the south coast of New South Wales, a fire started. And I actually saw it not long after it ignited. I was driving home from Canberra and saw this enormous big plume coming out of the forest. And look, initially I was, you know, mix of uneasy. Like I write in the book how, you know, when you've got a fire nearby, you know, you slip into this strange dual world where, you know, part of you is preparing for kind of life-altering catastrophe. You know, you're getting the fire pump ready, you're getting the fire kit out. But the other part of you is thinking, well, it can't happen, won't happen to us. So I'm still pursuing my story on the North Coast and I'm doing grocery shopping and all those normal things. But anyway, a week after it started, the fire, which was called the Carowind Fire, which is the name of the book, hit our place and hit it very badly. I was out. I got out before it hit with my 2 kids, but my husband stayed behind. It was pretty bad. He had to get rescued by our local RFS. Somehow our house survived, but we lost pretty much everything else and the house wasn't habitable. But that was just the beginning. You know, I remember that kind of wasn't a sense of relief, but after the fire hit our house, I kind of had a sense of, right, that we're done. But that was actually the beginning. The fire went for another 2 months. And, you know, like lots of people on the South Coast, I spent a couple of months kind of shifting between houses, fire runs, the villages getting hit. It was a really disruptive summer. So after that, after the summer was over, I felt I had an obligation. You know, I've always been aware that being a journalist and a writer is a huge position of privilege. And I thought that I needed to use that to tell people what had happened. And, you know, ironically, I now had a very good, informed opinion about what it's like to live inside a climate change world. So that's how the book came about. And look, I wrote about lots of aspects of the fire, certainly as we've touched on the incredible way that communities came together. I mean, one of the big themes of the book, I guess, was preparation or lack of. So when I was kind of tracing it all together at the end, I kind of dived back at least a couple of years and then, briefly 10 years. And it's amazing when you go back and you read the very clear warnings, the very clear science, the very clear weather patterns and the droughts that were happening. That summer was always going to be catastrophic. And it is, it wasn't just like I wrote in the book about the work done by Greg Mullins, the head of the former emergency leaders for climate action, I think they're called, and the warnings all through 2019 that he was trying to give to the government, saying we need to get ready, we need to get prepared. And it wasn't just the former emergency services leaders, it was people from Bureau of Meteorology were giving briefings to the government saying 2 or 3 years of drought, there's bad weather systems coming, this is looking really, really bad. So there was lots of warnings. So it's remarkable to me. And the other big thing that was going on, kind of a lot of it hidden from Australian people's view as well, was that the bodies in Australia that are responsible for leasing big firefighting aircraft were really lobbying the government, saying we need more money and we need to order more planes now. And they were repeatedly rejected, like time and time again. There was some, as a result of this, I think, is like a lot of communities, to be frank, were really, really unprepared. There was a couple of really outstanding cases of communities who were prepared. There's a little place on the south coast of New South Wales called Kangaroo Valley. And they had a really interesting story in that about a year or two before the fires hit, the deputy captain, or he's the captain then of the local RFS, got together with the local COP. And the COP had been, he'd worked in the aftermath of the Black Saturday fires in Victoria 10 years ago. He'd actually been on body retrieval duty. So he knew what could happen. So they got together and started a really grassroots community group that basically did a couple of things. It educated people about fire knowledge, about what they could do to prepare their homes. It helped them make decisions about, should you stay or go? Really simple things like, they set up, in these kind of semi-rural regional areas, you might not know every single neighbour, if you're living kind of on a big country road with little driveways going off. So they just set up community networks of people's names and addresses and what their plans were. And that really paid off for them in the fires. Like in the area where I live, we didn't have any of that. Individually, everyone was really prepared. But the community work kind of came as the fire was barreling down. That's when we were, setting up WhatsApp groups of neighbours and saying who can see the fire, where is it? People are saying it's on my driveway, watch out, whoever's next. Like, that all happened really, really quickly. So the other thing I think that the book explored, and it's relevant today, and back to that point about how people feel now and how it can impact elections, is that I really tracked through the path of the fire and all the different communities and people it affected. And it was profound. Like I knew it, I guess, firsthand, because I'd seen a lot of it, and I knew a lot of people who lost everything, people who died, but then kind of tracking the whole fire throughout the community. And, something like, losing your home, it kind of unravels your life in a million ways. And that's happened to so many people. But I guess the other thing back on, trying to be not so pessimistic, as grueling, as hard as some of the writing was and the exploring and finding of the stories, there's also a lot of individual human resilience. Like, it's strong when it's connected with community. But a lot of people survive those fires in spite of absolutely everything. People, drove their children through fires with last minute, with decisions. If they turn left or right, one of them could be a fatal decision, and they had to make a decision on the spot. This is one woman in the book who I spoke to. She had, like, over the course of about 2 hours as fire was closing in, on her village, as she lived in Conjola Park, where something like half the houses were destroyed. She faced a morning where she had like 4 or 5 life or death decisions happen before midday with her 2 little kids in the back of the car, and every time she made the right decision. Eventually she banded together with some other people, and they did an incredible kind of escape out through the flames in their cars. People kind of jumped onto boats as strangers. People were kind of bringing boats into inlets and hauling people up, and in the aftermath as well, there was this that was another really, I think, important thing to mention about the fires, and what I wrote about as well, is that, we were not just unprepared for the fires as a country. So we'd ignored the science that said, the science for 10 years has been saying Australia is going to face increasingly catastrophic fires. So we more or less ignored that. But our systems as well are not set up for this climate change world. So as the fires were going through, phone systems went down, power systems went down. Towns where all these water supplies are connected to the power grid then lost their water. Roads were cut and couldn't be open for days. Trucks bringing diesel couldn't get down from Sydney because of the road being closed. So petrol stations had no fuel. You couldn't use FPOS. It was quite terrifying in a way to see the disintegration of our systems and how unprepared we were. Was quite terrifying. Felt really kind of like the ground had dropped away. But within that, people organised. So people flooded with donations. People, like I said, filled up boats that took them up the coast to deliver food supplies to communities that couldn't get food. A huge amount of work. But this was all very ad hoc. A lot of these evacuation centres that people would have seen on the news of, people crowded into beaches and surf clubs and halls. These were not evacuation centres, right? These were just buildings. Like some of the worst New Year's Eve fires on the far south coast, so around places like Malua Bay, where you had like 1,500 people plus animals on the water's edge, like with fire coming through the suburb towards them. The whole evacuation and the refuge was run by surf lifesavers who just turned up to help, plus numerous other community people, people who'd lost their homes and just emptied their, what they could of their car and brought it down to feed people. So, we weren't ready for what happened. I guess even though the community did step up, and I think ultimately the community has to come on board. Like, I think that we clearly need leadership from government, but I do think that we, as Australians, we do need to kind of accept, without doing everything, of course, we still need to do everything we can to slow the rate of global warming. You read the science and you see some of the fires that happened in the Northern Hemisphere in 2021, for example, that honestly made the Australian Black Summer look small fry at times. Like, a month or so ago, a community outside Denver in Colorado in midwinter, when there should have been snow on the ground, fire raced through. The parts of Siberia this year burned on top of permafrost. Really insane things are happening. So we must mitigate. Like, the world we are looking at is absolutely catastrophic if we don't. But at the same time, we need to be realistic about the terrible bed that we've made for ourselves and figure out how we are going to live with this. Are we just going to keep every couple of years going, oh my God, there's another fire, there's another 500 homes and 2,000 people on a beach, or are we going to actually, look for ways to be resilient and look for opportunities as well? So much of, I think, the discussion, unfortunately, falls into the negative about the costs of climate change. But I think there's extraordinary benefits, from, renewables, investing in renewables. Setting up microgrids, electrifying houses, getting, really cheap power, There's lots of incredible opportunities, and particularly for regional areas. And, you know, the research and data shows that it is regional areas and often socially disadvantaged people who suffer the most from climate change. And I've seen that, you know, with my own eyes. I've seen, if you're in a regional area and you don't have a huge amount of money to start with, something like a natural disaster can knock you back permanently, if maybe just for a couple of years. So I think that there's a really important discussion to be had around opportunity and how we can empower communities to save heaps of money by generating renewable power and actually have a way of defending themselves the next time a fire comes. So instead of, suffering through no power, no phone, no water, have good renewable systems that can stand up for this kind of thing. So, yeah, look, I don't know. I waver. I have days of being really pessimistic about the place that we've landed. Particularly when I, to be honest, sit down and read, about what the fire scientists are saying, and when I, as I've done some work over the last couple of days, dive into what happened in 2021 in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's really grim. But another part of me does see that there is an opportunity, if we act very quickly, to really change things and to change it in a way that our lives, there will be positives from this. There'll be more community connectedness. We can transition to a renewable future where people will benefit, and particularly people who from the poorer end of things. I mean, imagine not having to kind of, in a regional area, spend $5,000 a year on diesel every year to drive your vehicle up and down country roads. Imagine when you plug it into your house that has solar panels on it. So, yeah. So anyway, I'm both optimistic and pessimistic.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Bronwyn. Stuart, I think you're on mute, but I'm gonna just say thank you very much to both of you, and then turn to the questions and comments that might have come through the YouTube chat. Kathy, have you got any that have come up so far?
Yeah, just bumping one through to you now, Peter.
Okay.
And I'm very sorry, I forgot to put the person's name. Just a minute. That's from Oz Whistles.
Okay. So it's how should you rebuild for the next fire? That knowing insurance will not pay for it, but you need to do it anyway. So that's a curious one, Bronwyn. And
look, it's a really it's a common question. I mean, and I guess I can answer it on an individual level, but a community-wide level as well. So on a individual level, I mean, we were fairly well prepared anyway. So our property where we live, we've been off-grid for 10 years anyway. So we have our own power systems and our own fire pumps and our own water and all of that. So after the fires, we upped a lot of that. So, got an extra concrete water tank, got a better fire pump, built big Besser block, guard around the fire pump. We've invested a lot of money in really good fire sprinklers. Before, we just had kind of fire sprinklers that we were, attaching to the roof as the fire came. Now we've got them all built in. So that's an individual thing that you can do. And, I accept to a degree, I live in a forested area. So I understand the risk, and, it's interesting, my own personal reflections on having experienced fire. And now, because of the book I wrote, I feel like I'm much more informed about fire. I'm way warier than I was previously. Now I understand the potential now of the way fires can behave. So, I will do everything I can to build a resilient home, but I don't intend to be kind of standing in front of certain fires, for sure. I think communities can do a lot. Communities can work together and prepare. But, I think beyond that, though, in terms of government, government has to start thinking about all these questions of where we live and how we live and how exposed we are. So, I mean, fire, but it's also flood. We're very, we have entire suburbs built on estuaries that do flood and will flood. The other thing is heat. In terms of raw data, the most deadly kind of climate change weather event will be heat waves. So in 2021 in Canada, they had a week-long heat wave, and I think it was something like 600 people died, 200 people in one day, in a rich first world country. And I mean that, that's a real risk for Australia as well. So these are questions that our governments need to address about, how we build, what our communities look like, what kind of spaces do we provide. And the other big thing is land management, and that, I'm mainly speaking for New South Wales, but, all this land we have, so whether it's national park or state forests or private land, particularly the land that the government has, like national parks, I mean, it's grossly underfunded. You have a couple of rangers looking after vast areas. State forests, Forestry Corporation is it's not even a for-profit logging operation. They don't even make a profit. We need to actually invest in this land like it actually matters and that it's actually valuable, and conduct land management. So Stuart, I'm sure you've got...
Yeah, look, I'd love what you've just said, because I want to try and extract the long-term policy implications from what you've said. Because in a way, that last reference to, 2 rangers for a large forest is the equivalent of saying we can only afford to have 1 or 2 people looking after 100 very frail elderly people in an old people's home.
It's exactly the same thinking, yeah.
Exactly the same thing. So what I take, you've been talking about the personal being the political. Those examples from Kangaroo Valley were about a community identifying the vulnerable, coming together, establishing some sense of coherence. In other words, we have to, that's a public policy issue about living together collectively in relation to nature, to a changing and sometimes and often threatening environment. It's not a peripheral issue, it's central to the way we have to think and live. And so, I dare say, we're talking about the end of capitalism. We're talking about the end of every person for themselves, because although you gave an account and your book is peppered with amazing illustrations of individual initiatives, it's the aggregate of those initiatives into a collective sense of the public interest to be permanent, not just when faced with a catastrophe. I used to live in British Columbia, where those 600 people died. I used to live in the lower parts of Vancouver, around Vancouver, where for 3 weeks, hundreds and hundreds of homes were flooded, not just with water, but with the carcasses of cattle and chicken mixed up with diesel oil. So that seems to me to be a permanent state of affairs. We have to think in policy terms, not of how to respond to the next catastrophe, but how to live together joyfully, creatively, supportively, which suggests a very different set of values and a different way of thinking from major political parties telling us that we need to get back to normal. And that's almost the most threatening thing I can hear at the moment. I don't want to get back to normal, because the normal produced the dangers that you dealt with down the South Coast.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Stuart. And one of the minor tragedies, I think, of the last couple of years is that during the bushfires on the South Coast over kind of 2019, 2020, there were a lot of networks formed. And I think that there was a really strong sense of recognition in the community that, we are stronger together and we really need to connect. And a lot of informal, becoming more formal groups did form. But then in March, COVID came and lockdown came. And, so there was this immediate kind of dislocation of people, and a lot of, yes, some people started hooking up on Zoom, but a lot of that kind of community networking and those gatherings did dissolve. And look, they've come back again, and some areas stronger than others. Like I know on the far south coast around the Cobargo area, they've maintained really strong community connections. But yeah, they need to be rebuilt, and people need to get involved in their communities and set up these networks.
I'm a great believer in the language we use, in the language we're using in the conversation between us this evening, but also the language that's used in local, state, national politics and in international affairs, because it's only the language about, for example, access to water, access to power, access to means of support for people who are frail, and even, dare I say, use of words like generosity and kindness as centerpieces of policy. Instead of that, we go out of our way to be massively cruel to asylum seekers and refugees and discard the frail elderly as of little consequence. So the language, and if you write a long piece for monthly, that might be what it's about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Okay. We've got another question. This is really blunter. Do we have a better chance with a Labor government? Handball.
Well, that in Four Corners last night, when that group of allegedly marginal voters were asked to make a judgment about Anthony Albanese, and the previous week they'd been asked to make judgments about Scott Morrison. I mean, the essential theme, well, there were two common denominators in terms of Labour. One was, please show a little bit of courage in public life and in policy making. And secondly, identify one or two policies for the collective benefit that people will comprehend and start to feel enthusiastic about. So if Albanese and his advisors were listening, that's two lessons that they ought to take away.
And I think, I touched on it earlier. I think that it's time to, it's clearly beyond time to move on from that stagnant debate in Australia of, is climate change real or not, right? That's hopefully we can shelve that for good. But hopefully we can start moving on as well from framing it as, or how much is it going to cost to do something? Or what are we going to lose if we do something? And kind of switch it forward. I've written a couple of pieces in the last few months. I did one recently for The Guardian about, it was a profile of Saul Griffiths, who he's with this group called Rewiring Australia and Rewiring America, who talks about, the electrification of homes. And there's a really good pitch for, how setting up homes on renewables can actually save most households $5,000 a year. It's really positive stuff. I also did a piece for The Monthly. I did a profile on Helen Haynes, who's the independent member for Indi in Victoria. And she's doing some really interesting work on putting through legislation. I think she's actually introduced it now to enable communities to have local power grids. And a lot of that came out of the bushfires in 2019, 2020 in the Gippsland area. And communities like the ones near where I live, who found themselves without power for a week or two as a fire is bearing down. So she's now trying to find ways where communities can set up their own independent power that is a buffer. So when there is a problem with the mains line, they still have a way of having power. So, I guess it's the question of, will Labor be better? I mean, I don't know, but I think it's time that we just try and shift the political debate a bit more forward-looking. Yeah.
I mean, I want to introduce a simple word called transition. I mean, Australia we're all, particularly our kids' generation, are transitioning to a different way of thinking, a different way of life. It would have to be. because the talk is about largely coal-dominated constituencies. You'd think that the only issue affecting climate change, in political terms, was a handful of coal mining constituencies in New South Wales and Queensland. But if you look at the question of transition in policy terms, you'd have to say that the tens of thousands of asylum seekers and refugees wandering around Australia with no rights to anything are living in transition. The millions of people suffering terminal illness or trying to recover from are in transition. When you're looking for the frail elderly to move from a degree of self-sufficiency to caring in a home where they don't want to go, you're talking about transition again. So the relation. So we need to drag out the policy implications of living in transition to a collective benefit, instead of the selfishness that's central to neoliberalism that says, look, everybody should invest in the stock exchange and hope to hell they make $1 million.
Can I go back to the question of insurance, Bronwyn, that the reports are pretty clear in the media that there's still hundreds and hundreds of people in the South Coast who can't rebuild after their homes were destroyed. So is there first of all, a failure of the whole insurance sector, or is it that there needs to be an even bigger policy from state and federal governments about recovery of these communities?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of points to that. I mean, I think the issue of insurance is going to be absolutely enormous going forward. And you read what all the big insurers are saying, and I mean, they're very worried. They've been taking climate change seriously for a long time. But we are looking at really large parts of the country. And there's already some, I understand, kind of northern Queensland that are susceptible to flooding, which effectively, where a whole lot of homes effectively become uninsurable because the premiums are just too high. And that's because insurers assess the risk of where these houses are built and say, we can't do that. And I've heard some kind of isolated cases of that starting to happening around here, actually more for flooding, less than fire. So look, that's a huge issue, because you're going to have a whole lot of people whose home, I mean, if you've got a home and you want to sell it and it's an uninsurable home, then, you're in deep trouble. And again, this will affect people on lower incomes predominantly. So I think that is something that has to be looked at. What was the second part of the question? I've just lost that.
If the insurance industry can't really deal with this situation, is there a need for a bigger government-led policy?
So in terms of recovery, so it's absolutely true on the South Coast now that there are still, I mean, I don't know how you quantify it, hundreds, thousands of people who have not nearly got their lives back on track. So yes, there are people still living in sheds, there are people living in caravans, there's people who have got some kind of housing but are in way worse situations. I mean, it's been massively exacerbated by the fact that since the pandemic started, there's been this enormous relocation of people out of the cities to regional areas, and property prices have absolutely skyrocketed. So like every day for the last year on, the local Facebook pages, you see plea after plea after plea of families saying, I've got 3 kids, I've always paid my rent on time, but we're going to be homeless in a week. There are people living homeless up the road from me now, it's really tough. But I guess the broader point I'm making, and look, there's been a whole lot of issues with the government announcing money, announcing spending, then it doesn't get spent. So there hasn't been enough to help communities and help people. But the broader point, if we want to really step back, is that the costs of unchecked climate change are catastrophic. You have a fire rip through a community and it's almost incalculable, the trauma, the financial loss, the housing loss. So it's not even just a case of saying, well, look, okay, we'll give you a grant and we'll, build a resilience centre here and a new town hall here. That's all good stuff. But we need to really recognise that the cost of doing nothing, so the cost of pretending that this is not happening and that we're not going to adapt and we're not going to try and mitigate, it's never ending.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just said is that you can't, if you want to talk about adjusting to climate change, probably in most parts of the country, certainly down where we live on the south coast, you've got to talk about housing policy. You've got to talk about access to rentals, access to affordable housing. You can't really talk about adjusting to climate change without reference to people's right to have a roof over their heads and with a sense of security.
Yeah, and that's an enormous issue in regional areas now. I mean, I know it's an issue for the city as well, but the lack of affordable housing is it's crippling for people.
I don't want to sound too light-hearted about this, but at a public meeting in Huskisson a couple of months ago, when all the candidates for a local election, about 200 people there, and this issue came up, and a very kind of wise guy stood up and said, well, he knew what the solution to affordable housing and rentals was, because nearly 80% of the homes in Hyams Beach are unoccupied, and he thought there should be a collective squat. That all the homeless people should move to Hyams Beach and occupy these splendid homes. But in a way, it sounds like a facetious comment, but it's about addressing massive inequities.
Okay.
So there you are. Peter, if you want to have a beach holiday, I can identify a place in Hyams Beach.
Okay, I think we're coming close to the end of our time. I thought that I'd just ask if there was any local response, politically, to the Bega by-election outcome, since I think that the state government got a big shock. And I did hear on the radio this morning on the news a gentleman who said he was in charge of the federal government's recovery grant scheme for the fires. It seemed a very strange coincidence, but is there any real movement, do you think, Bronwyn and Stuart, to react to the failure that's so obvious so far?
I think people are pretty angry. I think that so where I am, we're north of the Bega electorate, but I suspect a lot of the sentiment is the same. I think that, every other day I would run into someone who will want to talk about how they feel betrayed post bushfires, how they feel let down. I also heard that interview on Radio National this morning, and it was remarkable. I mean, he kept arguing that we're doing all this stuff, but it's like, well, but it's not enough.
There's nothing there.
But it is, as Stuart touched on it, I think people are, people did, and rightly so, during the fires, they did feel let down. I mean, we didn't have the water bombers we needed. We didn't have the resources we needed. People were putting out fires themselves. Towns were getting blasted to the ground, and then no one was turning up for days to help them. Like, people were really, really let down during the fires by the state, and that has continued since. But I think politically as well, it is kind of starting to connect with a lot of those other issues, and that people are looking around and going, yeah, actually our health services are rubbish, like staffed by amazing people, but, we can't have babies in our local hospital anymore. You can't get a specialist appointment anywhere. The housing situation, people can't find rentals or, let alone buy a first home. The situation in public education with overcrowded schools, like fantastic schools for the great people, but they deserve better resources. So I think a lot of these things are starting to percolate in people's minds, and they're looking around and going, well, actually, we're feeling like we're not getting a very good deal here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stuart.
No, look, I've appreciated enormously what Bronwyn, what Bronwyn wrote about and your observations tonight, Bronwyn. Look, I'm concerned about the longer term policy issues, but I'm also concerned about how we implement anything. I mean, I used to work in the war on poverty programs in the States when I was a lot younger. And I remember Galbraith coming here when we did an evaluation of war on poverty. And he said, you know, we passed a lot of legislation, but we gave no thought as to how to implement any of it. And so that the business about saying, for example, in the Bega area, you've got a massive shortfall in the health and medical resources. So maybe the election of Michael Holland, a real doctor, not a spin doctor, may be a catalyst for addressing that issue in that constituency.
Okay, just briefly, I know we're winding up, but what you say about, you know, how we do policy is absolutely right, Stuart. I mean, it's occurred to me so many times since the fires, you know, the method of, you know, getting a bucket full of grant money and giving it a name and saying, right, community groups, you can apply for this grant, to ask traumatised bushfire survivors to, you know, get together, form a group and then apply for a grant. I mean, to be honest, the year after an event like if you've lost your home or you had a trauma like that, you can barely tie your shoelaces. Like, you know, it's asking these people to do the work when really there should be some care and generosity and actually like coming in and saying, right, let's work with you alongside you. But yeah, it's just struck me that the applying for grants just doesn't work often in that situation.
I mean, it raises the question: who are the key workers in society, not just in the economy, but in society? And they're mostly the people whom we've paid peanuts to, or they're underfunded, under-resourced until there's a catastrophe, and we say, oh, we should have more, and they should be better trained.
Well, and they're not doing that anyway. I think we should wind up there. So I really want to give a special thanks to Bronwyn Adcock and Stuart Rees for tonight's presentations and discussion about really visceral issues affecting big communities in our state and nation. And, you know, there's so much more to come. So our next session is also on a Tuesday evening, March the 1st at 6 p.m. online on the topic, Only the Economy, Morrison's election platform. We want to have two speakers, but we've only got one right now. It's Frank Stilwell from Political Economy at the University of Sydney. And we will find a climate speaker because we think that's the sort of second big issue, as I think we explored a bit tonight for the coming election campaign. So we're looking at a critique of the way Morrison's coalition is approaching the election. So that's at 6 p.m. sharp on March 1, online because of the ongoing pandemic impact. But following that, and still depending on the public health orders and the pandemic situation, Politics in the Pub will be back at Hotel Harry, but on a Sunday instead of a weekday. On Sunday at 2 p.m., the first Sunday and the third Sunday of the month. So the first of these will be on Sunday, the 15th of March. So please tell your friends and let's make the in-person Politics in the Pub a success at this new time. So the program for the first half of the year is circulating now, and it's been adjusted for this switch to the Sunday. And please join the Politics in the Pub Facebook group as against the page to get notification of events. And the video of tonight's program, and also all of them previously, are available on our Facebook and at our website, politicsinthepub.org.au. That's through our YouTube channel. So thank you very much again, Stuart and Bronwyn. Congratulations on your book, Bronwyn. And Kathy, thank you so much for stringing it all together technically, and we're online and we're going to get this up on YouTube. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you, Bronwyn. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.